Okay, hi. I'm just working through your draft essays and noticing that a number of students are making similar mistakes in their essays. And I wanted to take you through a body paragraph of one of our students and give you some feedback on how to do it a bit differently. Okay, so first thing is that you need to ensure that you show me which question you're answering. So ideally you'll put that at the top of the page. So the question is, what techniques did the writer use to convey the thoughts of their characters, narrators or speakers, and to what effect? So there's two parts to the question. It's the techniques. Well, there's three parts really: the thoughts and to what effect. I usually find that students can say what the techniques are, but they often forget the effect and also not explicit enough with the thoughts. So let's have a look at this body paragraph. This is the first body paragraph, and from the thesis it is supposed to be about the fact that Duffy has used the technique of dramatic monologue. So the paragraph starts, "This poem is written in the form of dramatic monologue from a female's perspective, opposite from the original story, which was in the perspective from a male King Midas." Okay, so this is background information. It's not a topic sentence. So what you really need to do is consider whether this is the best place for this information. It really should be part of the introduction. And so from this point, this poem, all the way down to here is material that would be better placed in the introduction. So that's where you give the context. So we're going to delete all of that. Okay. And even this next section, in this poem, Duffy focuses on an aspect of the well-known character King Midas and presents an imaginary response from his wife's viewpoint, giving fresh, thought-provoking and comical insight into the couple's life. Again, that's all context, so we can delete that. Okay, now I've read through this, and the main point of this is really the dramatic monologue and specifically the first person point of view. So the fact that Mrs. Midas is writing in her own thoughts and feelings in her own first person point of view. So we need a topic sentence that does that. And the first sentence reads, "The poem gives insight into Mrs. Midas's thoughts and feelings." Now that's actually not too bad because it's explaining how it links to the question, the thoughts and feelings, but what it hasn't got is a technique. Okay, so what we need is a technique, and as I said, we're going to use narrative voice. So I've drafted a topic sentence. Okay, so I'm just going to paste that in. Okay, so I've made it really clear for the examiner by saying the technique. So I'm using words from the question. The technique of first-person narrative gives the reader insight into Mrs. Midas's thoughts and feelings throughout the poem. Okay, so then we can take out that second sentence and join it up. Okay, now we've got the example next. But what I want to do is follow Peel's structure. So P is point or topic sentence, and then we need to explain before we give our example. So we're going to have to explain what her thoughts and feelings throughout the poem are. So it's important when you're explaining parts of the poem that you follow a chronological structure. So in this instance, the student has given an example from the very end of the poem, which is when she's, the narrator is quite angry at her husband, describing him as selfish. But later on in the paragraph, she talks about the very beginning of the poem where Mrs. Midas says, "I just poured a glass of wine, begun to unwind while the vegetables cooked," etc. So that's what we want to do. We want to explain the very beginning of the poem before we start on the end of the poem, because that makes it easier for the reader to follow. So I've drafted a sentence that follows on from this next topic sentence. Okay, so what we have now is a sentence that explains what's happening in the first stanza. So let's go through the topic sentence again. The technique of first-person narrative gives the reader insight into Mrs. Midas's thoughts and feelings throughout the poem. In the first stanza, Duffy establishes Mrs. Midas as a wealthy housewife who is content with her position in life. Okay, so her thoughts at this point of the poem are that she's content, but this changes later. So chronologically that makes sense. So then we need to put some text that supports that comment. So we already have most of that here down at the bottom of the paragraph. In the first couple of lines, she is winding down and collected as she says. So let's bring that right up to the top. Okay, so we've reordered it, but we don't want to say in the first couple of lines because that's a little informal. We'll say she appears. So we've got in the first stanza, Duffy establishes Mrs. Midas as a wealthy housewife who is contented with her position in life. So we'll change that to she appears to be winding down, relaxed, and collected, and says, now put a comma before says, I just poured a glass of wine, began to unwind while the vegetables cooked. We've got two lines here. The kitchen filled itself with the smell of itself, relaxed, steamy breath, gently blanching in the windows, but we don't need all of that, so we're going to delete all that. Okay, that's enough quote to unpack. Okay, so we now need to explain this. So I've drafted a sentence and I've included the fact that it's a narrative of first person because that's what we were talking about. So her first person recount, which is another word for narrative, of her domestic kitchen setting, along with long soft vowel sounds in the half-rhyming words of wine and unwind, establish Mrs. Midas as calm and contented. Now that's quite important because we've looked at the individual words and sounds as well as the effect of the mood as calm and contented, and as we look through the poem later on we know that that changes. So it's about establishing her thoughts at the beginning of the poem and how they change during the poem. So what we want to do now is introduce Mr. Midas, who's the other character in the poem, and how they're interrelated. So here's the sentence that I've drafted. These thoughts are before Mr. Midas captures sight of Mrs. Midas captures sight of her husband. At the end of the stanza, the change in her thoughts and attitudes are signalled by Mr. Midas, who is standing under a pear tree snapping a twig. So by using that quote, I've told a little bit of the story and also showed how her thoughts and attitudes are changed. Okay, and that's what you need to continue to do throughout your first body paragraph until you get to the end of the paragraph. So you will have at least used one more quote and explained it, given the example and explain the effect, and then we're going to finish off our paragraph with a linking sentence or several sentences, and that link has to be back to this question. So that's about the techniques the writer used to convey thoughts and what effect. So I've drafted a few sentences, and here's my sentences here. Paste. Okay, so by showing Mrs. Midas's response and thoughts to her husband's actions, Duffy characterises Mr. Midas as selfish and greedy, more interested in wealth than his wife's needs and interests. Okay, so that's why, showing the thoughts to show Mr. Midas as selfish and greedy. So then what's the effect on the reader? So the reader empathizes, not emphasizes, empathizes with Mrs. Midas's situation, and her thoughts provoke the reader to consider the impacts that greed and materialism has on relationships and families. Okay, so we know that's a theme that goes through much of Duffy's work, so that makes sense. It appears that Duffy may be indicating that materialism does more harm than good and creates loneliness and isolation rather than happiness. Okay, so that's linked directly back to the question about what effect. So you have to do that in every paragraph. So basically we've started with a clear topic sentence, we've given an example, we've explained it, we'll do another explanation, example and effect, and then finally we summarise it up with this. And that is paragraph 1 of 3 for this essay. So the student has more examples down here and may be able to use a second example from here to fit into this section here so it's not all wasted. But at the end of the day, you need to follow that really clear structure in order to do well in this essay.